Hello and welcome back to another Giant Slayer TFT Top 10 video. Today we're going to be going over the top 10 compositions for all of Set 3. There's been a wide range of comps throughout the set, so the focus will be on consistency as well as overall impact on the meta. Keep in mind that while this is a top 10 list, the placement of each comp varies greatly depending on the patch and the meta. That means placements aren't rigid and each build could easily move up or down depending on what part of Set 3 is being discussed. With all of that said, let's get into it. But before we begin, please don't forget to click the links in our description. We have a giveaway going on right now to celebrate hitting 10,000 subscribers. Give your support to everyone who helped make this video happen. We host many TFT tournaments with plenty of exciting content to come, so be sure to also follow our Giant Slayer TFT social media pages. Alright, let's get back into the video. Starting off with our number 10 composition, we have 6 Blade Masters. Okay, yes, 6 Blade Masters isn't exactly a composition, but it does cover 2 builds, Slash Bros and Shredder. We're combining them because they have similar concepts, as both comps use a Blade Master as their primary carry and are focused on re-rolling the 3-star set carry. We also need to acknowledge that Xayah carry or Shredder is not always 6 Blade Master. Originally it started off as just 3 Blade Masters with other synergies thrown in to buff Xayah. Later on in the set is when it shifted over to being 6 Blade Master, but the constant has always been Xayah 3 as the carry. Master Yi carry or Slash Bros remained relatively the same throughout its history in Set 3, though it really only had an impact on the meta after the mid-season update. This is due to the addition of Zed, who was played as the 3rd rebel for the build and occasionally was turned into a Blade Master. Essentially, the idea of 6 Blade Master focuses on a playstyle that really defined a good portion of Set 3, and that's re-rolling. There have been many reroll comps, and while some have been more consistent than others, it's worth highlighting 6 Blade Masters as they have dominated at times, more so than many of the other reroll builds. Xayah 3 was a ridiculously strong champion, and Master Yi 3 was nearly unbeatable at times. So think of this placement as not just for 6 Blade Master, but also a nod to the playstyle of rerolling. Okay, moving on, we've got the number 9 overall composition for Set 3, Brawler Blaster. Jinx really was a highlight of Set 3 as a premier 4-cost carry. She has several compositions that were made around her, but Brawler Blaster quickly became a favorite because it was so familiar to Set 1. The basics of the build use 4 Brawlers as your frontline with Jinx as the main carry. Additional blasters were then added to both help Jinx do more damage, but also in spreading out her damage to get resets quicker. Brawler Blaster was never overly dominant, but it has always been constant throughout Set 3. It's waxed and waned in viability, but the core concept of the build never changed. This made it easy to play and understand, making it one of those compositions that players always fell back on when they were unsure of what to play. This, combined with Jinx being an overall strong champion, is why Brawler Blaster is in our top 10. Up next, we have Vanguard Mystic as the number 8 comp. First off, let's preface this by saying Vanguard Mystic is one of the harder to place compositions on this list. It only became a viable option after Cassiopeia was introduced in the mid-season update, and at the end of the Set 3, it kind of fell off the meta. Despite it being relevant for a smaller amount of time than other comps on the list, it's hard to deny how much of an impact this build had on the game. Vanguard Mystic was often played as a catch-all composition against the current meta, which made it very versatile considering it's based around only 2 traits. But during the times it did well, it was an easy counter to either high physical damage comps or high magic damage ones. Much like Brawler Blaster, it had a simplicity to it that made it an easy go-to build for anyone that was unsure of what to play. It's also a build that really highlighted the notion of playing to hit top 4 instead of going for first. The average placement was usually 3rd with Vanguard Mystic, but regardless of where you ended in the top 4, it rarely placed below that. The consistency along with the simplicity of the composition is what earns Vanguard Mystic its spot in the top 10. The composition coming in at number 7 overall is Dark Stars. Dark Stars are also hard to place on this list because there's been so many balance changes to the trait that the viability of Dark Stars has always been fluctuating. Originally, the trait didn't do well until it received a few buffs and Xerath was added, giving it another carry for the late game. Prior to the mid-season update, this composition didn't do too well and wasn't that popular, though it occasionally had a place in the meta. It wasn't until the mid-season update that we saw a big change to how Dark Stars functioned and thus made them more viable. After that, we saw more 4 and 6 Dark Star focused compositions. With Jhin, Shaco, and Xerath all being viable carries, it made for really flexible builds. Later on, there were more buffs to various Dark Star champions, and that's when we really saw the composition and trait dominate the meta. Overall, Dark Star has had a tumultuous history in set 3, but we can't ignore the impact that it's had on the second half of the set. Moving along, we've got another composition that only became possible with the mid-season update. We're of course talking about Astro Sniper, which comes in at number 6 on the list. There's no doubt that Astro Sniper was going to make it on this list. This composition was a constant part of the meta after Astro was introduced with the mid-season update. How strong it was definitely varied, but it was one of those builds that players could turn to if the opportunity presented itself. One thing that we want to highlight about Astro Sniper, besides its consistency, is how cohesive this build was. Teemo, Jin, Nautilus, Gnar, and Wukong just work so well together by providing a bunch of crowd control and a good mix of physical and magic damage. All of the pieces fit together, making this one of the best designed compositions of set 3. Next, we have Star Guardian Sorcerers as the number 5 overall composition. Star Guardian Sorcerers had a rough time throughout all of set 3. Multiple times it's gone from being either really useless or insanely dominant in the meta. But there's no denying that this composition has had a huge impact on the game. It's one of the builds that defined slow rolling as a concept and was part of the reason why Seraphs was turned into blue buff and Chalice of Favor was removed. Prior to the mid-season update, this build did well enough, especially once players realized that slow rolling for Neeko 3 and Syndra 3 was very strong. But it really stood out after the mid-season update with the addition of Janna and the changes to Syndra. Syndra being able to overkill a champion and do damage to another really boosted her viability as a carry. Overall, Star Guardian Sorcerer will go down as one of the top compositions of set 3 for how dominant it was at times and also the changes it brought to the game. Up next, we have Chrono Kayle as the number 4 overall comp. Kayle as a carry was, well, ridiculously good up until she was removed in the mid-season update. While we could go through many variations of ways to play Kayle, the one that stuck out most was Chrono Kayle. The build just did so well and was so consistent that it was a staple of the meta from the beginning of set 3 until Kayle was removed. The idea behind the comp is simple. Take Kayle and buff her to ridiculous levels with Chrono, Blade Master, and Valkyrie. And oh boy did it work well. If Kayle wasn't removed, it's likely that this comp could have easily taken the number 1 spot. The only reason it's not higher is due to the mid-season update, but we can't stress enough that this composition defined the first half of set 3. Alright, we're into our top 3, and to start, we have Mech coming in at number 3. Mech has had many forms during set 3. There's been Mech Infiltrator, Mech Sorcerer, Mech Victor, and several other variants as well. While there were times it fell out of the meta, it has overall been one of the most consistent playstyles of set 3. Mech is also a trait that has had a ton of changes done to it. Despite so many changes, it's remained part of the meta, which goes to show how good the Super Mech was. Besides being a top composition, it also changed the game drastically by being the main reason that the Demolitionist Spatula was removed. All in all, Mech was a composition that dominated the game when it was at the top and remained a consistent build throughout the entire set. It will easily be remembered as one of the builds that defined set 3. Moving along, we have Rebels coming in at the number 2 overall composition. Rebels is another composition that will be remembered as a defining build of set 3. The dominance that this composition has had at times easily placed it into the top 10, but beyond that, it's been hugely consistent. Sure, there were times that it fell out of the meta a bit, but even when 6 Rebels wasn't doing that well, you still had the option of running it early game with just 3 Rebels. Plus the fact that Jinx, a Rebel, has been a staple champion for practically the entirety of set 3. Another part of Rebels that needs to be addressed is Gangplank. Gangplank really made this composition shine in the late game and is another reason as to why Demolitionist is one of the best overall traits in set 3. His dominance in the late game can never be stated enough. It's worth noting that Rebels has had times in the meta where it didn't do that well. Because of that, it could be 1 spot higher and Mech could be 1 spot lower. But it will remain a top 3 composition for the set because of how incredibly dominant it has been at different points in the meta. And the composition coming in at the number 1 spot for all of set 3 is Cybernetics. We can't stress enough how ridiculously consistent Cybernetics has been for all of set 3. Like, seriously, this build has been part of practically every single meta. Even at times where it wasn't doing well, it still was played a bunch. Not only that, 3 Cybernetics has always been one of the best openers for the entire set. Cybernetics did overall get better with the mid-season update, as Vayne being added made hitting 6 Cybernetics much easier. But even before that, it was still one of the most played compositions despite needing an Echo to do well with it. There's no doubt in our mind that Cybernetics is the top composition of set 3 due to the sheer amount of consistency it had. And that is going to be it for our top 10 compositions for set 3. But before we go, we have just a few quick honorable mentions to talk about. First up, we have Space Jam. Space Jam is a composition that used Darius as the main carry to dunk on enemies. It was a build that did extremely well for a short period of time, and even then, it wasn't really that consistent. Then the mid-season update hit, and it basically vanished. We give the nod in our honorable mentions, as it was easily one of the most fun builds of set 3. Next, we have to give an honorable mention to Protectors as a whole. Whether it was the early reroll composition that used Xin Zhao as the carry, or later on the Fast 9 5-cost focused version of Protectors, this trait as a whole has been a big part of set 3. Unfortunately, every build that used Protectors tended to be short-lived, but we wanted to acknowledge the impact that this trait has had overall in the meta. Our last honorable mention is Void Brawler. Void was a trait that, well, struggled in set 3 before its removal. It was either not particularly strong or way too strong, and Void Brawler really showcased that the most. This composition's time in the meta was far too short to give it a top 10 placement, but it does deserve recognition as being a top build during the brief time that it was strong. Never forget the Laser Squid. And that is going to be it for today's video, folks. While there were builds that we saw consistently played throughout set 3, the overall meta was quite diverse. A big part of that is the mid-season update, which brought a good amount of change to the game. We know that there's going to be a lot of talk surrounding what compositions should be higher or lower on the tier list, or ones that we missed entirely. So we encourage everyone to make their own list and post it in the comment section below. Thank you for watching, and if you're enjoying our content, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for future Giant Slayer TFT videos.